So welcome today. We're here with two of our artists of our exhibition Textural Codes. Here with Carmen Mariscal, a Mexican artist, and Francisca Sosa López, an artist from Venezuela. And they're here to share us a bit about their practice and how it has been influenced by the Latin American art scene, whether or not it has been influenced by the Latin American art scene, or how we can fit these artworks within this context. I want to start with you, Carmen, so you can tell us a bit more about this wonderful work that we're seeing here and the story about Calladita te ves más bonita and the series of work that we have exhibited here in this exhibition.
Hi, Daniela. I'm very happy to be here. I don't know which question to answer before. I'm going to take you around a little bit of on the project Calladita te ves más bonita, and I think it's linked to the other question about Latin America. I don't think so much about if my work is in the Latin American art scene. I think my work, it's Latin American because I'm Latin American, and that's what my eyes saw, what my ears heard, what I lived through as I was growing up. So I have those cultural and personal references that come out in the work whether I want it or not. And sometimes I have tried in the past, because when I started working as an artist in the 1990s, there was this whole, there were like two different movements at the time. So there was like in Mexico, what they call the Neo-Mexicans, which were painters that painted very recognizable sort of Mexican scenes. And there were, on the other hand, artists like Gabriel Orozco that started using like a more universal language. So I was caught up in between the two, and I did not want to work under the representational mode of the Neo-Mexicans, and I started exploring more than a cultural world, an inner world, and try through that to take my own references that I had grown up with. So there's where this work comes from, because I work a lot with phrases and words that we hear since childhood growing up. And Calladita te ves más bonita is a saying that is told to women and girls in Latin America, but especially in Mexico. It's also told in other languages, like in French is sois belle et tais-toi, and in English it could be sit still and be pretty, but it's not exactly the same. What I find difficult in this and problematic also is that in Spanish, it's in the diminutive, so calladita. So just be small, just be pretty, just shut up. So whenever a woman or a girl has to say something, her voice is silenced, and more often than not by her own mother, her own aunts, by other women. So it's like a preservation of patriarchy through silence. So
by women.
By women and men, but this is something that I always I'm talking about, is about how also us women continue feeding patriarchy this way. And patriarchy is fed by silence mainly, and by non-action. And action starts with a voice. So I started in 2017. I did the first lip imprints. So I asked, first I did them with myself, and then I asked little by little around 80 women to choose their favorite lipstick, put it on, and do an imprint on a piece of paper, this A4 paper, and it was like a portrait, but you could only see the mouth. And then I named each portrait the name of the lipstick and the woman that was portrayed there. So lip marks are like fingerprints. They're individual for any of us. And then I asked them to tell me what they had been told since they were children, or now, of what they could not talk about. And I recorded their voices, and then together with a sound designer from theater, we created a sound installation with everything that women are supposed not to talk about. Then for the paperwork, I stitched the lips, and I did a whole wall full of them. It's an installation. Some of them I photographed and I blew up big, because it's not just to have a larger piece of the same subject, but it is also to talk about how how big the silence is, how the silence is always overwhelming us, the non-talking. And then I did other pieces related as well. I etched some of the other mouths onto steel plates and put a mirrored surface inside and wrote inside the things that these women were not supposed to talk about. And then when the viewer comes to the gallery, he or she can open these sort of books, see their portrait reflected, and see the words, the things that women can't talk about. So mainly that's the project.
There are so many things that I want to ask you about, because we discussed one of the main things that you said at the beginning is that your influence as a Latin American artist doesn't come necessarily by studying necessarily other Latin American artists themselves, but by living your life as a Latin American and in projecting that into your artwork. And for me, this is really interesting because, as I have understood, most of your practice you have developed it abroad. So you've developed a big part of your practice in France, and then now you're here in the UK. And how does that influence your artwork, this other external influence from other cultures, other countries, other dialogues, that in a way puts into question what this debate that you were posing at the beginning between the neo-Mexicans that were like ultra-nationalists in a sense, and then Orozco in the other end saying, no, I don't want to even be referenced as a Mexican artist because that creates a category that in a way can tend to be very limiting within your practice. So how have you navigated this world in Paris and then now in London? And how does other cultures have influenced as well your practice? And you've encountered that this practice might not just be a process that is inherently Latin American or heard by Latin American women, but might be something that other people might be affected by as well.
Yeah. That's a very interesting question. I think, it's a question that I always had. I was always torn between my country, between Mexico, between being Mexican, Latin American, and woman, and then being abroad and always being the other, no? So you end up you're in Mexico, you're working as an artist in the 1990s. There are a few women artists showing, you're always the other. Then you go, for example, I go and live in France, I am the other, and then I am the other because I am Mexican, but then I am, and I'm a woman, and I'm the other of the other of the other, and then I'm Latin America, and then, so it can get quite complicated, but then there's a time when you come, at least in my case, in peace, and just say, okay, these are the pieces of the puzzle. So we're all composed of different influences in one way or another, and I think for me, it has been very enriching living in different countries because it informs the work differently. It make you read the work differently, see it with a distance, which sometimes I think that if you don't leave your culture, you can't see it with a distance. On the other hand, sometimes you have to be really aware that the work does not get nostalgic and just be real. So I tried to go, for example, I did part of this work in Mexico, and I tried to speak to and really go and be there. But some of the women that participated here were in New Orleans, for example, or they were immigrants from Africa in France. So I just tried to connect with the person, not thinking so much of where they come from.
Yeah, and at the end of the day, what you're dealing, it's a problem that affects many individuals, not just women around the world. But also, I think I feel like your work has a strong influence within the Latin American art scene, even if it's not a conscious influence. I think there's a strong trajectory of conceptual artists in Latin American addressing social and political subjects that in a way relates a bit with your work as well. And both your works have something in common that I find very beautiful, is the use of weaving. And in your case, to close a mouth, to limit, to in a way show a sign of strength and power over a mouth that is there willing to talk. And then you have also used this weaving and practice of sewing to depict other relationship with the material, but also comes from for example, an artist that makes me unite both of your work in a way is Cecilia Vicuña, and her work with weaving as well, and text as well, and also her desire to manifest with her artwork many social realities that she has lived as a woman, as an indigenous woman in her case, as a Chilean woman, as the other also living in the United States. And in your case, you also developed this work here in the UK, right? So you also, a big part of your practice have been developed here in the UK, or not?
Yes, so I think most of my education has been abroad. Therefore, I've been confronted as Carmen with the fact that I am not 100% Venezuelan. It's strange because when I left for the first time, I started realizing, oh wait, I'm not like a normal human being. I am something else, and I'm this other thing that you're talking about. And I feel we all as migrants can relate to that. And actually, the sewing for me, I started sewing like other pieces. I started sewing onto canvas. I started sewing a lot, and I always try and hide the thread. For me, the thread, for it to be sort of like hidden amongst the piece, is very important, because I feel that in a way, it's as we are migrants, we are intertwined in society. We are in it, but we disappear, and we're not necessarily heard, but we're there. We're in the surface of it, but we never really belong to somewhere else. But then when you go back home, if you spend time abroad, you also don't ever feel like you belong as well. So we, in a way, it's very interesting. And I mean, it's a huge privilege to be able to do this and say this from this perspective, but you end up never truly having a home again, because you sort of like adapt and get very comfortable wherever you are, and then you take that through your journey elsewhere. So it is many things that Carmen said. I completely agree. It is completely true. You start, battling with so many different selves that have to be represented, and then you have to figure out exactly what it is that you want to talk about in your practice, so that it makes sense to you as a human being, to what you want to talk about. And then it also has to be it has to be read internationally if that's what you want, but it's definitely a choice, and it's a personal choice.
Absolutely. Like, both your answers makes me think about a book of Milan Kundera called Identity, where he faces the same dilemma in a way, because he moved to Paris and then he went back to Czechoslovakia, and he arrived and he felt neither here nor there. But coming back to your work, I feel like this invisibility of the thread is very beautiful in your work. Is something that you have to go and really explore and try to read the text. That you have to really go into the piece and really get a close-up of the piece in order to read it, and it becomes a very intimate relationship with the piece, sort of what happens with your mirrors as well, that you have to see yourself and in a way generates a sort of performance with the viewer that invites them to interact with the artwork and not just receive the artwork. But one of the questions that always makes me wonder, and maybe you decided to do this because you were here in the UK, is that you wrote a love poem or a love letter to Venezuela, but you did it in English.
Yes.
And that decision, it's always baffling me, but at the same time, it makes the work very particular in that sense.
So, since the first time that I left Venezuela when I was 11, I started realizing that I come from a place that's not normal, that's going through a lot. And the reason why I left, and that so many times I have stayed away or have gone through a lot of things, it's because of the political climate and the social climate and economic climate and all that is happening back home. So what I realized one day here when I wrote the letter was that it was very strange and very hard to explain the feelings that I and many other Venezuelans have. and I did not know how to explain it because it is a strange relationship. It's a love-hate relationship that you have. And I realized that the best way to explain it was through heartbreak. Yeah. And I think that that is something that is quite universal. And it is true that it is a letter that definitely, like, Venezuelans cry. I send it to my mom. She cries every time she reads it. And I have it also in Spanish, but I did write it in English. And it was because it's the better way for me to explain my feelings towards home. And it was, in a way, I did it to sort of like set my place and be understood. And when most people hear it, they don't understand what's going on or who I'm talking about until the very end. So you're going through all of this, and I have a lot of people, international people, that are like, wow, I felt, like I went through this with my boyfriend, or I went through this. So it is a way for people to be able to connect without being from a difficult place or without being from this situation.
Yeah, absolutely, because you're addressing, at the end of the day, I'm not going to say universal feeling, but also something that other people can relate to as well in other circumstances. Which brings me a bit what we were discussing before, how you want to take this project further and sort of expand it to not only other people, but other genders, other nationalities, so why is this decision to move it away not just from women and this feeling of many Latin American women in this case to remain small, to remain silent, to remain pretty, that being pretty it's equivalent to being silent and dumb in a way. But why do you want to move it away from that and diverge it to other individuals?
Because I think this silence is what feeds patriarchy. And I think it affects us all as human beings. It affects people from all genders. Trans, gay, lesbian, men, heterosexual men. I think heterosexual men suffer so much, and without even realizing about what they can't talk about. So they live and they do so many things in silence, which confuses the whole society, and and takes the balance out. And I just think that if we really want an equal and caring society, we must just hear everybody's voices, but from truth.
Yeah, absolutely. Mm-hmm. And in a way, it also doesn't relate just to the situation with the gender, but culture as well, because this system has created a reality where certain people are more valued than others, or certain cultures are imposed over others, which is something that leads me a bit to the second work that you made, that you decided to write again the Silva of Andrés Bello, a Silva that he wrote here. And this figure of who Andrés Bello is for Venezuelans, for Colombians, for Chileans, for Latin Americans, and the figure of who he is as kind of defensor of this Latin American culture against maybe the imperialist Spanish culture, but also other cultures around the world, trying to make it a distinct reality. So can you explore a bit more about this artwork?
Yeah. So it's funny because before, when we were talking about education and how, like Latin America inspires you and such, because even my education in Venezuela, it was very Eurocentric. So at the same time, for me personally to learn about Latin American artists or to understand about Latin American art and Latin American history, it has definitely been like a personal pursuit. So what Andrés Bello did in 1827, I think it was, he tried to say that basically Latin America could be independent. We did not need of the Spaniards. We did not to be conquered. And we had everything we needed. We had, everything from land, We could produce our own wine. We are smart enough. We have poems, we have poets, we have literature, we have everything. So he wanted to create that sense of independence in Latin America. And he wrote it here in London. And it's funny because, yes, I did all of this here in London. And he is from Venezuela, and he was working at the time with Simón Bolívar to do, independence. So yes, I think that this sense of being sort of abroad and talking about home, it is something that also happens as well to everyone. And as Carmen was saying, that it helps you sort of like distance yourself and actually also realize that it's something that has happened to me a lot. It's like, home is great. It's horrible that we have to leave. It's awesome. You start seeing, like all the beautiful things and all the nuances that you don't necessarily notice when you are back home and when you feel that that is your day-to-day life. So this work, I did it. It is one of my favorite poems, actually, Silo de la Agricultura de la Zona Tórrida. And I reread it here because, again, I was trying to reconnect with my own culture and with my origins. So I reread it here, and it is incredible how it really does sort of describe the land, the nature, and everything that is tropical, and everything that is not only Venezuela, but, all the Southern American continent.
Yeah, I want to touch two of the points that you said. One is that, and it happened to me as well, the difficulty of learning about Latin American art history, because most of our classes, most of our education, both in Latin America and abroad, has been centered in European and North American art history. In my case, it was the same. Like, it was my own personal pursuit to study and to research many different Latin American artists. But I touch on this because, for example, Venezuela has a very internationally strong tradition of geometrical abstraction and op art. And it has an influence, a very strong influence in its artists as well. I don't know if you ever felt that influence or that pressure or that need to comply with this certain aesthetic standard, or whether or not it was never an issue for you and you felt like at liberty to propose something different.
Oh, no, definitely. Before coming here and starting my master's degree, I was doing mostly portraits, and it was all portraits of Venezuelans, and all the backgrounds were geometric inspired. So they're all about this constructivist geometric thing that's going on in Venezuela, and that you literally are walking down the streets in Caracas or driving or whatever, and that's what you see everywhere. And that's what most collectors collect of Venezuela. They think of Cruz Diez, they think of Soto, they think of these spectacular, amazing artists, but that's basically how they're limited. Whereas I feel that Mexico has a broader spectrum of artists that are doing different things, and that, just give you more of a sense of freedom in a way. So I did feel this need to use it, but then I discovered that it wasn't necessarily working for me. It wasn't necessarily the way I had to move forward, and that Venezuela is not only that, because it's not only this European community that came to Venezuela, came to Latin America, and came with the history behind them that inspired all of us. We're so much more than that. We are from the people, that are from there. We are the land. We are nature. We're so much more than the European migrants that came with this history. So I wanted to break free from that and try and explore and really understand what is home for me, and what it is and why it is that I want to talk so much about it, and which would be the best approach to do it. So
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Francisca. So coming back to this idea that you were exploring before about this reality of being a Latin American, I always find this concept a very difficult concept to explore, especially defining what it is to be a Latin American. We are so different, Mexicans, Colombians, Venezuelans. I think it's an impossible reality to try to tackle or frame what it is to be a Latin American. And this has already been questioned by many artists, critics, writers. But a reality that I face here in the UK is that this notion of what it is to be a Latin American became important only when I arrived here in the UK. I never posed myself this question when I was in Colombia, because in Colombia, I'm in Colombia. Like, who would question themselves their importance of being not only a Colombian, but Latin American? And I want to ask you, Carmen, and then finish with you, Francisca, what has been this process of being a Latin American, in this case in France, and then in this case in the UK?
Okay, well, for me, it's a little bit complex because I was born in the United States being Mexican. So already that, I went to Mexico when I was a baby. So I didn't really live in the United States, but there was always this. So growing up in Mexico, you have this huge border that is like in everybody's mind all the time. Like Porfirio Diaz said, so far from God, so close from the United States to Mexico. So we've got this border. So we're always living in the edge between Mexico and the United States. Europe is like, it's the conquistadors, we're the colony with Spain, and then France. Wow, France is like our saviors, the intellectuals. Our constitution is based on the Napoleonic Code. So it's like, they're like different exits. The UK, when you're in Mexico, is something very far away. So I think there's this tension in Mexico, for me at least, between the United States, between Spain, and between France. And then we also feel cut from the rest of Latin America because we're supposed to be North American. So we're North American, but we're Latin American, but we're Ibero-American. So it's really a very complex thing. But we're also Central Americans for some people. So, and it depends on, it depends on where you are in Mexico, because if you are from Mexico, like from half Mexico to down, your origins are from Mesoamerica, that are the same as Central America, because we have the Mayan culture and all the pre-Hispanic cultures, and then it's very complex. And then half of the United States used to belong to Mexico, so we find ourselves there also. So it's very complex at very different levels. So you're growing up with all these, and then there's also all the racial differences. No, so how Mexican I am if my skin is not so brown, but how there are a lot of things, and there are a lot of very tough social divisions where, for example, indigenous people in Mexico have always been forgotten, and even more indigenous women. So there are all these very complex things. So you grow up with this baggage, and then you find yourself, like I did, living in France. So it's the romantic. No, you live in France, and France has a very, very strong relationship with Mexico, but with all Latin America. So there you arrive and you are Latin American before being Mexican, because you have everybody that fled the dictatorships, because you have like all the Mexican artists, starting from Diego Rivera, who built themselves in France, and you're part of it. And as a Latin American in France, you really have a place. There's La Maison de l'Amérique Latine. We have this huge, beautiful, and very interesting place where we have conferences, dialogues, exhibitions. Mexico has a very important cultural center. So your Latin American identity continues growing. So you go to very interesting talks, you meet Cruz Diaz and everybody, and you are in Latin America in a very privileged dialogue with other Latin Americans. So you have your place in a way. I am the other of the other of the other, but I've got my place. Then you arrive to the UK. I had lived here previously because I went to art school here. And when I went to art school here, I think there was just one other Mexican or Latin American, and I was in St. Martin's, and the whole St. Martin's where I was there. So we were very exotic. And then I come back now, and the reading of what Latin American is very different, because we're also put in the same pocket as Portugal and Spain. So it's another reading still, which is interesting also, but I just have to switch my brain to read a different. Yeah, it's Ibero-America. So it is very interesting. So it just puts a lot of questions in my mind. And on the other hand, if we're all the way here, it means that yes, we're Latin American, yes, we live far away, but in a way we're also privileged because we came all the way here. So there are a lot of questions that arise from, and a lot of questions of reconsidering identity at each stage.
Absolutely. And in your case, how have you felt like developing your practice here in the UK and your own identity as a Venezuelan and as a Latin American?
So I think for me, like the first time that I encountered being like Latin American was when I moved for the first time. And I moved to Madrid. And then I was like, oh, we talk a little different. And they were like, why are you singing all the time? And I'm like, I'm not singing. It's just my accent. So I started like realizing that I, in a way, was apparently not as good, you know? So you start feeling sort of this, weird feeling. And then I went back home, and then when I went for my undergrad in the US, every time I said Venezuela, they were like, where is that? What is that? And I'm like, or if they heard me speak Spanish, or they're like, oh, Mexican. And I'm like, no.
That's not the only country.
Cool country, but no, it's not mine. So I started, and nowadays, because of, you know, all the political issues, we are more sort of like in the map, not that much, not as much as we should be. But now people know that Venezuela is, you know, exists, and it is somewhere in Latin America. So I don't necessarily have to explain that as much. So I don't necessarily have to fight with the fact that, no, I'm not Colombian, or no, I'm not Mexican. I'm from this, you know, other place. It's also there. And then, so that was like one thing that I not struggled with, but dealt with in the US, because people, and also Americans have a concept of, you know, Latin Americans. That is very much not true. So it's this other thing. And then when I came here, again, I was very exotic. In my school, I think in my year, it was only a Brazilian and me. I know, and an Argentinian as well. But yeah, it was very exotic, very different. And again, starting to deal with this notion of who am I, how, why, and understanding and sort of trying to have my place in a way. And it's hard because in a way, if you come from bigger country, if you come from the US, if you come from France or whatever, people understand and have this predisposition and ideas of what that is. Whereas you come from scratch and you have to build up an entire language in which you have to explain who you are and why you are and how you act the way that you act. And it all comes with, first of all, the ideas that everyone else has about Latin America as a whole. And then you have to sort of locate yourself in this one different place.
Absolutely. So I think with that, thank you so much for joining this conversation, the two of you, and thank you so much for joining us today, and thank you Via Art Prize for this invitation. We invite you to also see this exhibition. It is online. You can see it online, textile codes. You can find it on our website. We're going to put it on the link below, so you can go to our website and have a look at the exhibition, have a close-up look at all these different artworks that are exhibited of this wonderful artist, and it will lead you also to their pages, so you can discover more about their productions and what will they continue to do. Thank you so much, and I hope you have a wonderful time. Thank you so much, everyone.